So today we're going to be talking about Darwin's theory of evolution. If you have not taken, or if you've not printed off the note sheet, it's there in this week's folder, so you can print that off if you want to. If you don't have a printer at home, you can just take notes on a piece of paper. We'll go ahead and get started here. So in 1859, so pretty good long time ago, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species. It was a book that he published, and in this book he described his theory of evolution. And this theory had two major parts, and I do want you to pay really close attention to what those two parts are. But let's go ahead and highlight Charles Darwin. So you can kind of think of him as the father of the theory of evolution. This was his book that he published, On the Origin of Species, and in it was his theory of evolution. All right. Now, the two major parts of his theory were natural selection, which I think most people are able to take that in and feel pretty comfortable with that part of his theory. The second part of his theory is called common descent. And a lot of times people have more questions about that part of the theory and maybe have a harder time, accepting maybe part of that. Today, I'm just going to be talking about natural selection. And then tomorrow, you'll have the video on common descent that Miss Minikino will be doing. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about that first part of Darwin's theory, which is natural selection. And what natural selection is, it's a process in which organisms in nature with variations that are most suited to their local environment survive and leave more offspring. So basically what that is it's a process in which the organisms that are best suited, that fit into their environment best, they blend in, they can catch food best, they're fast, they get away from their predators, they're just better suited to their environment, they're going to survive longer, and then they obviously are going to have more offspring. Okay, now I want you to really pay attention to that word right there, process, because a lot of the terms in this unit are going to have very similar definitions. And so there's certain terms, certain words that I want to pop out at you when you read them. All right, so that's natural selection. Now, some things to that go along with that is Darwin, he hypothesized that individuals with certain inherited variations just means differences, are going to be better suited or adapted to their life in their environment. If you look at all the squirrels in an area, they are not all exactly alike. There are variations, there are differences. Some of them are going to have bushier tails, some of them are going to have slightly different color coats. Okay, some of them are going to be fatter, some of them are skinny. So, and those slight variations can sometimes make them better suited to their environment. And so that could be with squirrels, that can be with different types of plants, different types of insects, but they all have those variations within a species. Okay, now adaptations, this is a term that has to do with the characteristics that increase an organism's ability to survive and then, of course, to reproduce. These adaptations, they can be body parts, they can be colors or behaviors. So it could be like really sharp claws, really good eyesight, long legs that help them run, or it might be certain types of behaviors to attract mates. So all of those are what we call adaptations, and those are characteristics that help the organism survive. Okay, another term that you want to associate with natural selection is the term fitness. This was a term that Darwin used, and let's highlight the word term. Okay, and this is used to describe how well an organism can survive and reproduce. So basically, the higher the fitness the better adapted the organism is. So if they're, really well camouflaged and they can hide well from their predators and they can find food well and everything, they're going to have really high fitness, which means that they're going to be able to live longer and reproduce and make more offspring than those that have low fitness. Organisms with low fitness are not going to survive as well, and so therefore they would not produce very many offspring. Okay, and so let's make sure we get that. So high fitness, let's say well-suited organisms are going to have high fitness, and then those that are not well-suited are what we would say low fitness. Right now, all of this natural selection, you could sum it up with just a real simple saying: survival of the fittest. Okay, and you've probably heard that phrase before, and that just means those that are best fit for their environment survive and reproduce. Okay, so just to recap, make sure you know natural selection is the process in which organisms that are best suited survive and reproduce. Variations or differences within a group or within a species. Adaptations are characteristics, you might want to circle that word, that help organisms survive. Fitness is a term or a description of how well the organism can survive and reproduce. So it could be high fitness or low fitness. And then, of course, if you want to just sum up, what is natural selection? It is survival of the fittest. Okay. All right. So there are different types of natural selection. There's 3 types. There's stabilizing, directional, and disruptive. And if you look at the words, it kind of gives you a hint as to what each one is. Stabilizing. Let's go back here. Okay. So stabilizing selection is when the average individuals in a population are going to be better suited, better fit for their environment, so therefore they are going to live longer and reproduce. So basically what that's saying is that nature selects or favors the average individuals. Okay, so stabilizing selection, the average phenotype are better fit for the environment, and because of that, that really decreases genetic variation because all of them are kind of the same. So what that would look like is here's your what the population looked like before selection, and then after, you see that it kind of narrows it up and it stays right there in the middle. Okay. So let's say you have some birds, and they're all the same species, but you have some that have really, really large beaks, some that have medium-sized beaks, and some that have really small beaks. And that particular year, it seemed like the seeds that were produced were all sort of, not really large, not really small, but kind of average-sized seeds, and the birds with the average sized beaks were able to open those seeds easier than birds with large beaks or birds with small beaks, and so they lived longer. They survived longer, passed on that trait for that medium sized beak, and you would see that that trait being passed on to the next generation. Okay, that is stabilizing selection, where it's favoring that average phenotype. Okay, now the next type of selection is directional selection, and just like the name suggests, it basically moves in one direction. Okay, and you can see that here on the graph. The dotted line is showing the original population, and then after selection you see that it's moving towards one end of the graph. So basically what's happening is one extreme phenotype is going to be favored over the average or over the other extreme. Like in this case, you've got the butterfly colors here. You see that the darker that would be like, this is one extreme color down here, and then the really lighter is the other extreme, and then these are average. Well, you see that the extreme are being favored, and so it's moving in that direction. Okay, so directional selection, one extreme phenotype has a higher fitness and have more offspring than individuals with average or other extreme phenotype. So it is going to favor one extreme phenotype. Okay, so with stabilizing, it favored the average group. With directional, it's favoring one specific extreme phenotype. Like with the bird example, maybe you had a few years where there was not a lot of rain and all the seeds were really, really small. Then you might see that birds with the really large beaks could not open the tiny seeds, nor could the medium-sized beaked birds, but the birds with the small beaks were able to handle and open the small seeds really easily. And so they would survive longer. They would pass on those traits, that trait. So it would favor the smaller beaked birds. Okay, that would be directional selection. Okay, and then the last type of natural selection is disruptive. Okay, and you can see here on the graph, that kind of looks like a disruptive graph. Here you've got the dotted line showing the population before selection, and then here, what we're seeing here in the blue, that is after selection. So you see that you've got two extremes being favored now. So each extreme is favored and the average is actually going down. Okay, so the average starts to die out. And eventually what can happen is the average phenotype, those organisms that have the average phenotype would completely die out, and you would have the two extreme groups, and they would be maybe so different that they would be like two different species. That can lead to speciation or to lead to a new species. So here we're going to say disruptive selection. Both groups of organisms with extreme phenotypes are better adapted and have more offspring. So basically, both extreme phenotypes are going to be favored. So here we're going to highlight both extreme phenotypes are favored. Okay, and this particular type of selection could lead to a new species. Remember, stabilizing can lead to like very little genetic variation, whereas with disruptive, you can have so much genetic variation between those two extreme groups, two extreme phenotypes in those two groups, that it could lead to a new species. Okay. So like here with the butterflies, you got the light colored butterflies. Obviously they do really well. They live longer. They pass on their traits. The dark butterflies, they do really well. You know, their numbers are high. They live longer. They pass on that trait. But the average, for whatever reason, maybe they don't blend in with their environment or whatever, but they start to die out. Okay. So now, since we mentioned the production of a new species, the next thing we want to talk about is speciation. And speciation is the formation of a new species. Okay, and it's usually caused by some type of isolation. The first type of isolation is geographic isolation, and that word kind of gives you a hint as to what it has to do with. It has to do with geography, it has to do with some sort of physical barrier. So an event creates a physical barrier, and that barrier divides a population into two or more separate groups. So it could be a volcanic eruption that maybe causes a barrier uh, of rock or whatever between that splits a group into two, a species into two different groups, or maybe separation of a landmass into islands. It could even be a man-made geographic isolation, like maybe where a highway is built or something like that that splits a species up into two separate groups on each side of that geographic isolation. And what could happen is over time, those two groups could become so different that if they were brought back together, they wouldn't be able to reproduce. And so it would create a new species. All right, next is temporal isolation. And the way I always remember it is temporal, time. So temporal isolation is when a species develops different reproductive cycles. So it has everything to do with timing. So like some of them might reproduce in the spring, where some are in the fall, and over time they might become so different because of that that they would never reproduce because they have those different cycles. So members of the spring cycle would not interbreed with those in the fall, and then they could become so different that they would not be able to interbreed and become two distinct species. It doesn't have to do just with time of the year. It could also be time of the day. There's some flowers that open during the day, some at night. So it doesn't have to be just time of the year, but it does have to do with time. So you might want to write the word time here to remind you that it's all about the timing. With temporal isolation, is about time. Okay. And then the last type of isolation, the last thing we're going to be talking about today, is behavioral isolation. And just like the name suggests, it has to do with some sort of behavior, some sort of action. So this is when two populations do not interbreed, and it's all because of differences in courtship behaviors. So it has to do with how they attract mates. So maybe they have a very distinct mating call, like maybe you have birds of the same species, but some of them have maybe a slightly higher pitched mating call than the others. And so it eventually might create two very distinct groups, and they might, over time, would become so different that they could not interbreed. Also, birds, especially birds, have very, some of them have really bizarre mating dances and things like that. So those types of courtship behaviors could lead to behavioral isolation and eventually a new species. Okay, so that is pretty much it. I would suggest that you pay really close attention to the graphs that go along with stabilizing, directional, and disruptive. You'll need to know the definitions and the graphs for those. And don't forget to pay really close attention to those terms that have to do with natural selection. Remember, natural selection is a process. Variations are differences within the group. Adaptations are characteristics that help them survive. And then fitness is describing how well they survive within their environment. Okay, so make sure you look over that and use your notes to do your daily grade today. All right, y'all take care.